There we go. And then I just want to make a note also of our code of conduct. You might have seen this when you RSVP'd. Just a reminder that this is a safe space for everyone and that harassment of any kind is not tolerated in this space. So if you have any issues around that, please DM me in the chat. And again, I will get to it as soon as we can. And with that, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome to Online and Offline Safety. First up, I'd love to introduce Susanna. Susanna Walker is the founder of Make Space for Girls. She is also an author and former TV producer who was outraged when she realized that not only had her local council only provided outdoor facilities for teenage boys, but that they also didn't propose to do anything about it either. Susanna, welcome. It is so wonderful to have you today here in this space. And I'd love to get started by hearing from you how you define safety over at Make Space for Girls.
It's a really interesting question because actually, in some ways, the important thing is not how I define safety, it's how teenage girls define safety. Because, and this is a big part of who we are as a charity, we are here to amplify the voices of teenage girls themselves and actually help them get what they want from public space. But also there's a really key difference because when you talk to adult women about safety, it basically means in the context of urban space, will I be attacked? Will something unpleasant happen to me? Will I be murdered? But for teenage girls, the issue of what feels safe is much broader. In a funny way, I think being teenage, they're less worried about that. What they're worried about is feeling that they have a right to be in space. Because so often, I mean, teenagers in general get tutted out, moved on. You know, we're forever going, oh, what are those teenagers just hanging around in the park? That's what teenage play looks like. They're meant to be there. They have no other space in which they can be autonomous. So we should be welcoming it. But instead we're all going, oh, they look at them getting in the way. And we don't ever say, look at all the older people taking up the benches in the parks, just sitting there. It's particularly, our disapproval is particularly aimed at teenagers and they're very sensitive to it. So being safe is about being welcomed and approved of and feeling that you have a right to be in space as well as just not actually being attacked.
Oh, wonderful. I absolutely love that definition. Thank you for kicking us off with such a strong start. Thank you, Susanna, for being here. Next up, I'd love to introduce Hera. Hera Hussain is the founder and CEO of Chayn, a global nonprofit that creates resources on the web to address gender-based violence. Chayn's multilingual resources designed with Not for Survivors have reached more than 500,000 people. Raised in Pakistan and living in the UK, Hera knew from early on that she wanted to tackle violence against women. She believes in using the power of open source technology, trauma-informed design, and hopeful framing to solve the world's most pressing issues. Hera, welcome. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this space with us. And the same prompt for you as well. We'd love to hear how you're defining safety over at Chayn.
Thanks. It's really great to be here, and just seeing everybody's introductions is amazing. Safety for Chayn is, twofold. It's safety in the sense of, of tackling harms, the kind of gender-based violence that women, specifically women, but also other marginalized genders face, all the way from, familial violence, domestic violence, to sexual violence, technology-enabled violence, but then also the safety of being yourself online and enabling that, which is all about, how can we create online spaces and offline spaces which allow women and other marginalized genders to really thrive. How can, women take up space that is theirs? How can they make space for others? How do we enable that sort of feminist future? So that's when we think about that, that's the framing that we come to this work with. And most of the people involved in Chayn, both either as volunteers or staff, are survivors of gender-based violence from across the world. So we really think about it from a global perspective, rooted in our sort of very different experiences about what liberation from this kind of oppression, patriarchal oppression looks like, and what our resistance to that looks like in terms of healing and creativity, hope, joy, and all the good things that we deserve.
Thank you, Hera. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm already starting to see some overlaps in our online-offline conversation. Thank you for kicking us off there. And finally, I would love to introduce Laura, our third panelist for today. Laura Bloomer is the founder of Back Technologies. Laura is interested in the intersection between business, society, and technology, and passionate about entrepreneurship, equal opportunity, and empathetic, authentic leadership. Laura, thank you so much for being here. And I would love to hear same thing from you. How are you defining safety over at Back Technologies?
Yeah, sure. Just to firstly, thank you everyone for coming. This great talk. And I guess to give a little bit more context about what BACK does is we help victims of online image-based abuse kind of take their power back in that situation. So if something's been shared on the internet that has kind of been used to embarrass or discredit them, we are that service that kind of helps to make that process easier for them. It's an AI tool that will find all the content on the internet, automate the takedowns, and then we'll find where it's posted or make takedown notices and create that evidence to then pass off to police and make that process a lot easier. So safety for us is just doing everything as like baseline kind of leading principle from a victim focus and building everything for them and thinking who is the most vulnerable person in the situation to kind of blow it out a little bit more and designing the product for them. And to give context to that, most companies will kind of build for the average experience. And that's, I think, something that kind of needs to change. And we'll go into that a little bit more as we go through this talk and bring more references to that. But yeah, it's really about that victim focus and thinking about how can we build this for them and everything around that.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for sharing that. So I'd love to launch into our conversation today with this idea of non-negotiables. It's something I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to designing for women. What are some non-negotiables? And I define it as things that we just cannot afford to overlook any longer, and because they've been overlooked for so long and have therefore, not created safe spaces for women and girls anymore. So are there some non-negotiables that you see in your practice? And what would you say are non-negotiables that practitioners out there designing products, services, experiences just cannot afford to overlook anymore if they are serious about safety, whether that's coming online or offline? Yeah, open to all three of you. Feel free to jump in.
I can go with that because it kind of links into what was previously talking through, but I was watching a video recently about designing for public spaces and accessibility. And one of the things that they were speaking about there is that with doors at the moment, they kind of have moved away from like door knobs, those kind of circular ones, because for disabled groups, they can be really hard to use. And you'll see more so these days, like those kind of handles that open. And so what he was kind of putting forward is that at the moment, a lot of the time we build for the average experience and then kind of like, okay, this is our typical user experience, but how do we now accommodate for these extra groups or vulnerable persons and add to that? But what he was kind of proposing was start with that most vulnerable situation, build to that, and it serves everyone. So with that doorknob situation, those don't really work. So they're using kind of more of those pull-down ones. But then when you have an able-bodied person who is bringing in a tray of coffees, it serves them as well because that other doorknob doesn't work for them either. So kind of that switch. And it's a bit more of a long-term view as well of building for the most vulnerable and it serves everyone instead of that kind of piecemeal patchwork of building for the average and then kind of trying to match everything to that.
I would absolutely agree with that because it's one of the things that we keep saying, that when you're designing for teenage girls, you're not taking anything away from anybody. You're just adding, and actually by creating one of our core principles is you need a lot of different spaces, because if you just create one space, it gets taken over by the single dominant group. And guess what? Surprise, surprise, that's not often teenage girls. So by creating a diversity of spaces, you make room for all sorts of different people to find their spaces within that, not just teenage girls, as Hera said, other marginalized genders, people who for all sorts of reasons don't feel that they belong in the dominant masculine space. But I would add one other thing that I think is absolutely the core, and it sounds really basically obvious, but just notice that there's a problem. Because one of the issues that we face is that, as I said, everyone walks around going, oh, well, we built a lovely skate park for teenagers. And we're going, have you actually counted who's using it? And they go, oh, no, but it's for the teenagers. Girls can use it if they want. It's like, no, they can't, actually. So let's just acknowledge that there's a problem and to see it. I think Caroline Criado-Perez is spot on in Invisible Women when she talks about the default male. So much is done from the point of view of the default male. And if we can just step back from that and go, can we actually just look with some data of what's going on here? That's probably the biggest step to making a whole heap of change in a whole heap of places.
Yeah, and I think these are really great points, because this idea of like taking something away, I think, is a really core one that we have to like move away from when we're thinking about framing safety, which is also why sometimes I like breaking down safety into emotional safety and physical safety, because it gets people to understand that, you know, harm isn't just something that you experience like physically. It is also something that you feel it in your heart. So you withdraw from public spaces, whether they're online or offline, because you don't feel safe in them. So the world misses out on, you know, creativity. They miss out on businesses. They miss out on expressions. They miss out on like amazing people being online, on relationships being formed, friendships, work, so much stuff, and citizenship. So really thinking about safety in that all-encompassing way. And like, I mean, we have sort of 8 principles that we talk about. So I'm just going to name them, because for me, I don't like having a checklist approach, because I think that that's like where things go wrong. But these are the kind of principles that we call trauma-informed design principles, which we incorporate in our work. So there's safety, agency, equity, privacy, accountability, plurality, power sharing, and hope. And these are the kind of like elements that we represent when we think about, and I think safety kind of cuts across all of them.
Thank you for sharing that, Hera. And I think you're actually segueing us into really nicely into the next question that I had, which is, I think a lot of us here are curious about how safety is different online and offline. And I think you're very nicely situated in this online offline space, kind of right in the middle of it. So I will put you on the spot for this one to get us started. But, you know, how do you see online and offline safety to be different? How is it the same? What are some overlaps you're seeing? How can one learn from the other? Just the whole thing. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question. It's one of my favorite questions, because I really, you know, growing up as a digital native, I really don't see much difference between them. I think they're like extensions of each other, and with more and more young people just kind of growing up with technology, that the difference is seamless. There's obviously differences in terms of how we experience harm, and also how access works differently. So in parts of the world where device like ownership is low, obviously access to internet is like expensive, you know, that access becomes low. But on the other hand, in spaces like I grew up in Pakistan, and public spaces are just not just women have to really fight to be seen in them, to go to even going to a park. I mean, you have to go with family, you have to have male members of your family to be able to feel safe. Like there's just lots of things depending on which part of the country you're in. Whereas online, you don't have any of this. So it actually brings you a lot of freedom, of course, until, you know, you get harassed and experience cyber violence or online violence. But it's just that there's a lot of room for people who cannot express themselves, especially women and girls, that they can do online. I think Pakistan and India are the countries where people have, on average, 2.5 accounts per person, and that's because everybody has a fake account and like a real account, and then an extra account just because, why not? But you know, it's just it's this idea of being able to be free. So I always use the analogy of gardens to be for the web, because I think, like, you know, the web is like a big garden, and parts of the garden are really dark and weedy, and you know, there's not much love there, and then other parts of them are thriving and are full of flowers and things to do. And it's our job as people of the internet, as organizers, as designers, to really bring light into those areas which have been neglected and are toxic, so that everybody can enjoy them. So I really see them as like as being like seamless. You know, we know that from domestic abuse and stalking and sexual violence, often what starts online, you know, even if it's like it's something that's done by strangers, the fear of it is felt offline, right? And you carry with it, because your devices go with you. So your fear like doesn't go. If you're being tracked by your government, you know, you're literally carrying your tracker with you everywhere. If you are experiencing abuse in person, then often like being online is like a refuge. But then if that same like behavior follows you online, then that safe space is no longer there for you. So I think it's just like thinking about both of those worlds as being like seamlessly connected, and like how we design for, there's so much we can learn from urban design for online spaces, and there's so much like the urban design can learn from sort of like the way we can practice that solidarity and inclusion in like in how we're organizing feminist spaces online. So I think there's both worlds can really learn from each other.
I just, before any of you, other of you jump in, my mind is blown with this metaphor of the garden. I just absolutely love it. Thank you so much for sharing that. Susanna and Laura, sorry to chime in there, but yeah, I would love to hear from you.
I think, Laura, you go first, because I think I'm going to end up saying something slightly different.
Yeah, no, sorry, mine, yeah, kind of links in, so thank you. I guess, yeah, I've got two things to say on that. Firstly, online is, it really amplifies abuse, I think sometimes. I'm glad that we led with Harris, because it's a much more positive spin on it. But I think online has just made abuse so much more viral and inescapable. Like if you are a young person in a school and something is kind of shared online, it used to be maybe it would just kind of shared in this like in the friend group or something like that, and that would be embarrassing. But now it's online, everyone in school's seen it, everyone in the other schools have seen it. Like it's very hard to escape, and that's really quite overwhelming. And also just all your information is so accessible, and a lot of these tech companies don't really build safety by default. So when I started Backed, I enrolled with a whole lot of like intelligence kind of courses to kind of, I just kind of thought like better the devil you know than the one you do. I want to kind of know what I was up for and like what was out there and what people would do and how I could be vulnerable. And one of the all source intelligence courses I was on, we were looking at Twitter, and there's a website where I can put in someone's Twitter handle and I can see where they were within the last 5 minutes, like if they're, I don't know, walking through Knightsbridge or something like that. And that's because location isn't turned off by default. And I don't even have to be, there's no consent in that. I'm just following them and I've put their handle in. They haven't accepted that at all. And that's really creepy that someone can see where you were within the last 5 minutes. And like I have location on all the time because I'm using my maps to walk around everywhere. So it's, yeah, so I guess like safety by default by some of these companies as well is something we need to move towards. Yeah, online, it's so available to people walking on the street, like it shouldn't be. It should be a little bit more gatekept. But and then the other thing I would kind of say on that is online, offline. We're working with SWGFL, who are a nonprofit here in the UK, and they are producing a project called Minerva, which is a great project. It's with the Revenge Porn Helpline, who are pioneering it. And it's like an AI tool to be that 24-hour support when people need help. It kind of acts like a Clapham junction to route them to different systems, working with Facebook as well to kind of hash any images so that they can't be re-uploaded, and it stops that. But one of the big theses for this project and their work is through Revenge Porn Helpline, and I'm sure a lot of domestic abuse charities will agree with this as well, is a lot of online abuse then translates into offline as well. It can start as offline and go then online abuse, and online image-based abuse is used to kind of embarrass, discredit, control, blackmail a victim. So it's very linked, definitely.
To go back to Hira's excellent analogy, the great thing about the garden of the internet is that it has many different spaces in it. Where we find the big difference between offline and online spaces is that in actual urban space, if you're designed out, you haven't got anywhere else to go. You can always find a supportive bit of the internet. You know, there are many, as you said, there are many positive, flowering places. But for us, what we find is that when teenage girls look at public space, they go, it's not for me. They're actually not engaged with it. They have grown up in a world that says it's not for you. You don't belong here. There's nothing here for you. And so therefore they go and find their spaces online. Because I said it's really crucial for teenagers to have an independent space. You're not independent at school. You're not, unless you're very lucky, independent at home. The only place where you're fully autonomous is in a public space, and that's either on or offline. And it's really important that they learn to be autonomous online. But if we take them out of urban public spaces, there are huge health, it's basically saying you don't belong in the community, and there's a huge rights issue, there's a discrimination issue, but also it affects their health. That we're not giving teenage girls any spaces to be active and autonomous. And that's really, you know, at every level, they are less active than teenage boys. There's also really clear research now that says going out into what the jargon terms green space, which is a phrase I hate, but I haven't got a better one, is really good for your mental health. And for teenagers, even just going out for 15 minutes twice a week can have a big impact on mood and on negative thoughts. So it's, you know, clearly in a world where mental health problems are on the increase, it's actually vitally important that girls go out into real life spaces as well as into online spaces. So we do feel that there is a difference as well as a crossover.
Can I add something to that?
Of course.
It's a similar kind of point, but something that we've come to learn as well is this relates to politics as well. So a lot of conversations that we've had are have been a part of how do we get more women into politics and such, just through my other work as well. And this online image-based abuse and online abuse is one of the things that stops kind of young people. They just don't want to put themselves up for it because they experience it so much more, and it's kind of used as a tool against them to put them down, discredit them. We see it time and time again. It particularly affects women, public figures or leaders, sports people, politicians. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. To add to this incredible conversation, there's one thing that I saw that was really interesting is, you know, with the research in the parks in Vienna that happened that I think, Susanna, I'm sure you know about really well. One of the things that they realized from that research was that girls feel fenced in playgrounds. So to have more entrances and exits in the playground can help girls feel more called to be in it. And it's interesting, Hera, through your work, I learned about the quick escape button that exists on these websites where, you know, you feel safe to be, but you want to be really careful about who's watching over your shoulder. And the overlap I see between the two is this idea of exit strategies. We don't want to feel fenced in, whether we're in online or offline. And so this idea of if everyone just started to think about well, what's our exit strategy? What if finance, you know, services came with that, to know that we were not going to be fenced in, we were not going to be just locked in. That idea of safety increases. That's something that I've seen as an insight through some of the research. I just wanted to share that as an overlap that came up. And you know, yeah, and I'd love to move a little bit into the next question, which is around examples. And I think Laura, you already shared one that you know, the Project Minerva that's doing really great work in this space. But I'm curious to hear from the others. Where are you finding spaces, whether that's in products or services or public spaces or systems or programs that are designing for safety really well? Where are you finding inspiration these days?
I'm going to say there are some good examples, but what's astonishing in the real life space is just how little we know. one of my favorite pet peeves is that in the UK, there are more regulations about how to produce lighting that doesn't affect the habitats of bats than there is about lighting for women's safety. Yeah, I'm not even going to get into that. I have a whole rant that I could go into. But I think, again, it's just about thinking about it, because there are no hard and fast rules. Every place has its own upsides and downsides, and you have to be really specific about knowing the location, but also listening to the people who are there about what their issues are. Because the problem with principles is you barrel in and design something with principles, and they go, but there's a terrible underpass going to that park, so you can build the most beautiful park, and it's pointless because you've got the terrible underpass going to the park. And you can have broad design regulations, but really it's about listening to users and being alert to what they want. And there are, this is starting to happen in places, but it's a slow process.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of good example, obviously there's all the work that we are doing and other organizations are doing in the space of civil society. So I think that that's all good to kind of see. And I invite everybody to have a look at the sort of the work that Chayn does. I can put in the URL in the chat. We definitely put safety first in all of our work, and one of the key things that we look at the design process and all the things that we do. But other examples that I'm very interested by, so we've been working a lot with Bumble recently, and I'm pretty impressed by how much their safety and trust is a focus for them, which has been really encouraging for me to see, because when I wasn't working with them as civil society, you don't really get to see the inner workings of what's happening in these companies. I find that their kind of work on both image blocking, making it harder for people, really looking at who the perpetrators are and finding ways of both looking at the emotional safety of survivors, but also the physical safety, and having reporting mechanisms, tracking users better. I find that quite interesting. And there's a couple of new startups coming up, which I'm really interested in their progress. And they're looking at how do we create different kinds of social networks that are safety by design. So there's one that's specifically for young people in sexting, which I'm really interested to track the progress of. There's just loads and loads of interesting projects going on, which is flipping this build first, build quickly culture in tech to kind of put it on the other side and being how do we build slow and build with people. And I think that that's really, really encouraging for me. I also think all the discussion that we're having across the world around content moderation, around image-based abuse, it is definitely an area where we're seeing more, a lot more focus than there was 5 years ago when we started working on this. I mean, Chayn's been working on this for 9 years, but the absolute growth of policymakers that are talking about image-based abuse, for me, is really mind-bogglingly. I'm excited about that even if implementation is slow and it's not the way that we'd want it to be, the fact that this is on the agenda of most governments, and I'm not just in the global north, but actually everywhere. This is encouraging. And yeah, so I think that these kind of things give me a lot of hope. And I also, what I'd like to see more of though, is there's a lot of research going on into tech-enabled abuse, but there's not a lot of funding going on to tackling it, or a lot of action going on. So that's where I'd like to see a bit more work. But I'm, yeah, in general, when I look at everything, I come away being positive and thinking that I see progress, and that's what I aim for in life.
Thank you, Era. I want to move in some of the questions we've collected from the audience. There were a lot of different questions that came in, and I think the first one I'm going to ask is from Pip. He says, as a researcher on gender norms, I have found that a lot of work silos men and women away from working together on these issues. How can we get men and boys to join us in shifting norms and improving safety for everyone?
I I saw this in the prep, and I was so glad this question was asked. So thank you, Pip, for asking. I think it's so important. I think it continually kind of gets missed. I think because there's like so much hurt, like collective hurt from sometimes as practitioners, we can alienate a little bit. Like I was at a UN Women hackathon for like safe spaces, and it brought together a group of people from all different kind of disciplines, like developers, policy, like tech people, to kind of build some solutions around public spaces. And it was pretty much all women, and there was one guy that showed up, and no one kind of like, no one really included him, or like he was kind of there to help and like kind of offer his. So, and yeah, it was kind of interesting to watch from afar, and they need to be part of the solution, I think. And that's been my experience with BACT. Men have been super supportive, and they're like, yeah, I've seen this as an issue, or they've like kind of come and spoken to me privately and be like, yeah, I've been added into like these horrible like WhatsApp groups, and like I wanted to, but I think they feel a bit alienated sometimes. So I guess holding the space, I guess, and allowing them to help, and realizing that it might be clunky, they may say some wrong things, and just it just depends on like how much patience you have that day as well. And my kind of ethos with that is educate once, and then if they're like not really kind of improving thereafter, then I'll have less patience. But I think people generally want to help, they allow them, I guess, and kind of show them a way and have that patience and give them the answers on how to help as well, instead of just kind of something else I see is like, oh, you should just know, or like, this is just like, I can't believe you'd think that, or like people don't just, help them out, like give them the answer a little bit. And I'll stop on that. I'll stop going. But I love that question. I'm so glad it was asked.
I think my answer to everything is raising awareness, but actually, I think that the principles can be scary, but actually the practice ends up benefiting so many people that you can sort of take people along with you to some degree. When we were talking about the additional benefits of change earlier, there's a great American thing called the curb cut effect. And what it describes is when the first disability activists were campaigning for the kind of drops in the pavement we now take absolutely for granted in America, they did a study. They put the first ones in California, and they did a study 6 months afterwards. And what they discovered is now known as the curb cut effect, which is that all sorts of people were using them: people with pushchairs, people with mobility issues, people who just found it easier not to have to step down. They were a benefit. And as I said, creating stuff that works better for women and girls benefits so many other groups that once you start, you just go, yeah, actually, of course, why not? Having said that, there is still a lot of work to be done in changing behaviours of some boys and men, which I think we probably all agree with across our fields, that there is a minority of users of both online and offline spaces who are setting out to make it difficult for girls and women. But that kind of attitudinal change is very hard.
Thank you both for sharing. Moving into the next question, Laura is asking, what are some best practices for online safety? Specifically, how do we foster trust and safe spaces via virtual calls, which is a big part of our lives today, including this right here?
I guess, I saw this. It'd be good to have a little bit more context and like kind of what situations, because I think the answer might change depending on that. But my like quick thoughts on that are, if you're building for the most vulnerable group and thinking from their perspective, I think that's kind of a good default to lead by, because it comes across very genuine. It's like, I can tell a company's culture just by going through their website and their communications. Like, it leads through everything. It comes through in how they communicate, like what kind of values they set, what they prioritize in. Like if you are genuinely looking at from and building from and thinking from a victim or a vulnerable person's perspective, you generate that trust immediate, like it comes across. And then I think just to give an example, to kind of ground it, I went through the current kind of victim process in the UK, and they work with, you can speak to, I won't name names, but there's a legal kind of group that you can seek advice from as a victim, and it's like a free service. It's kind of law students who are, I guess, building up their experience. But I joined this call, like going through how it would be for a victim, and there was like 4 people staring down at me, and it was very intimidating. And I just felt like that was not geared or thinking about the victim at all. Like, even I was intimidated, and I wasn't even in that like situation. And there was kind of, so I guess that's an example, and I'll leave with that. But I think if you, I was thinking about that perspective the whole time, it's genuine, it comes across, they'll feel the trust. Like,
Yeah, and I don't know if this question is coming from a community building perspective. So on that, I think it's like looking at getting the values embedded in the way you work, the kind of people you invite, how you prep them beforehand, so for example, one of our programs, we actually, for all of Chayn's work, apart from the volunteers talking to each other and the staff and everybody interacting, survivors actually never interact with each other because we can't guarantee that safety. So all of our programs are meant that the interaction is always survivor to Chayn. And then we feedback in general. If we want to put something across, we actually don't allow like survivor to survivor interaction, which you could say has been proven to be one of the most effective ways of like creating healing spaces. But because we can't guarantee that online, we don't do it. In offline spaces, you are able to do it because you are physically there. You can look at people's identification. You can like create a lot of physical barriers, which is just not really that possible online. And that's not the kind of like model that we have. But in one thing that I get asked about a lot is like when you have so many survivors and people, one aspect of trauma is mistrust. It is like something that is natural to feel after trauma. Then how are you able to create this like community that's just like doesn't know each other and has worked together? And I think that takes a lot of care and consideration, but also just a lot of goodwill. I think there's just we are very proactive and structured in the way we create those spaces. So we, we have definite like rituals which we will know are going to happen, like when we have calls, how we decide the time of the calls, what's going to be discussed in the calls. We give a lot of agency back to the volunteers so they can like create, like add to the agenda, lead meetings. Everybody has to introduce themselves when they join the community. People have to add each other. There's just so many different like ritualistic aspects to the community, which I think people find a lot of comfort in, because it's like, okay, someone's here looking after this, someone's ensuring that this is working well. And I think that kind of sense of structure actually gives a lot of like it gives a lot of support, and it makes spaces safe. So because we're always there like monitoring that, but in less of like we're going to see everything you're doing, more like in a shepherdly fashion. We're there to kind of like steward the community and like to really look after it and nurture it. So yeah, that helps a lot in getting that trust.
Thank you, Hera. Next question we have is from Anna, and she's asking specifically about public spaces and parks. So she has several questions in this one big question, but the ones that I found were most interesting was how can parks be made to feel safe without having to securitize these spaces? And how do we balance safety-centered design in parks, for example, lighting and food vegetation, with not having as much of a negative impact on wildlife and environment? Susanna, maybe you want to take this one because it's focused on parks.
Yes, it's a really good question, and a lot of work certainly in the UK has gone. There's a thing called Safe by Design, in which the police basically tell you to remove everything and then you have a safe park, which is not great. And there's also the question, because it's something I've been thinking about in in relationship to another project, which is also how do you measure safety? Because I can see, for example, that you could improve a park and actually have more crimes reported in it, partly because if you might have double the level of crime but 5 times the number of women and girls in it, but also if you create a space where the women and girls feel comfortable reporting lower level incidents that they might not have reported otherwise, then you still have a successful park, but you couldn't measure that in terms of crime rates. So I think that's really important to think about, is like, what is the success we are measuring? And I'm pretty sure that the Safer by Design approach minimizes crime, but it also minimizes bushes and places for people to sit. So not so good. But I think there's one really easy way to do it, and it's the safest thing in the world is actually other people, not CCTV, not help points. So the busier your park is with a whole range of people, the safer it feels to everybody else. There's a park in York that's been doing some really interesting work with women and girls, and it's creating interventions and then checking back in and seeing how the girls felt. And one of the really interesting things was that they've been organizing classes actually for older women, but the teenage girls said, oh, that makes us feel better because there are other women in the park. They're doing stuff, that's good, but it's just having people around, and that kind of passive surveillance is really important. And you see that when you start looking, you see that all the time. I met some girls roller skating, skateboarding in a car park when there's a perfectly good skate park, about half a mile away. Partly the boys sort of slightly bullied them off the skate park, but also where they were skateboarding was a park that was near a really busy pedestrian path. That's a route in and out of town. So just that constant traffic of people is what you need. So putting spaces, putting facilities, things that women and girls are going to like in a busy place, let's sort of triangulate them with the toddler park and the cafe so that you're part of this big throng of people. And that is the safest place to be. And it's one of the reasons why, teenage girls so often go and hang out in shopping centres, because they're full of people and they're safe and they're dry as well. All teenagers apparently in Finland hang out in shopping centres because it's not cold. And balancing with wildlife and environment, I think it is, if you go to that idea, it is very possible. But I think you have to acknowledge that there are some places that are not going to feel safe. So if you've got an overgrown riverbank walkway, you just go, okay, fine. As long as women and girls can get from point A to point B, we're just going to leave that. They can have it in the daytime, but you can't make everything safe. It's about making the key routes and the important public spaces safe. And sometimes that has to come down in favour of the wildlife. Sometimes that has to come down in favour of the women and girls. But also there's new technology happening all the time. There's some really interesting experiments in Worcestershire with red spectrum lights. So because bat lighting at the moment is really, really not very bright at all. So, oh, great, we put some bat friendly lighting in it. It's like, that's not woman friendly. It's like somebody's put a firefly in a jam jar and buried it in the pavement. It's really not going to make any woman feel good about walking along a space. But they're as bright as normal lights, but much warmer spectrum, and they don't interfere with the bat's sensing abilities. They don't interfere with the bat's routes across from one piece of vegetation to another. So there will also be new solutions, but I don't think we've necessarily tried that hard to find them yet.
Thank you, Susanna. The next question comes from Jana, and she is asking about data collection. So her question says, how do we ensure the safety of respondents when collecting the data if several data collectors or enumerators are involved?
I'm happy to take this question. There's a really fantastic book called Data Feminism that I really recommend you read. And I think that, most of my career has been in the data space, actually. I was running Chayn as a volunteer. I only went full-time in 2020. So when you are collecting data, it's important to think about, what is it that you actually need to collect? Who needs to be involved? What are the kind of questions you're asking? What are you trying to get at? The kind of design questions you'd ask anyway, but then thinking about where is the information held? Does it need to be de-anonymized? Sometimes the information does not need to be anonymized. A lot of times when you're dealing with vulnerable populations, you really have to. So then how are you putting that anonymization in place from the really beginning? So then you can take out a step of the anonymization that needs to happen. Are you getting consent in the right way? Are you capturing the consent? Is it dynamic consent? And then, multiple people being involved in a project like that is not really a problem. It's because you can have any point of failure when it comes to data leaks. It's not just the 4 people being involved. It's about the process through which that data has to go through. So really that's systematically thinking about how that's captured, shared, reported back, where is it held, who has access to it. It's all those kind of considerations that need to be done. I mean, we work with survivors of abuse. I would say 90% of them are happy for us to use their information and give us consent for that. But the file in which we capture all of that information is only available to a subsection of our team. But the insights that are where it's anonymized are available to everybody in our community, and then we publicly post about it as well. So it's just about thinking about what are we asking consent for, and what is that information, which part of that is really sensitive, and we don't collect information we don't need. So we're a big believer in data minimization.
Thank you, Hera.
I can add to that. Just to cover off on a previous question as well about creating safe spaces, also just get regular feedback as well. I think that's something that we saw is where things go wrong, is victims being made to fit a process, and that kind of mentality of this is just the way we do things. It may not be relevant anymore. Constantly doing that feedback from those groups and testing. I'll park that one and then go onto the data one again. Yeah, I agree with everything Hera said as well. We kind of looked from that I guess, when we're looking through this process with police, so victims are often asked to collect their own evidence, and then they have to hand it over to police again, which is really recreating that same trauma that they've just been through. They don't know these police officers. It's probably a similar demographic of person who perpetrated this thing against them. And then there's been use cases of this content not being handled respectfully and being shared within offices. So and that's kind of when we were thinking about how, I'll go back on that again, and that kind of point on making victims to fit a process instead of a process to fit a victim. There's kind of a thing that's just how it's done. That's what we need to do to collect this and move this forward. But that's not how it works. Victims won't come forward, and that's what we're seeing. It hardly ever gets reported. That's just not the way it works. So when we're kind of building, and I guess it de-risks us as well. We anonymize data as well. We break up that process so that people don't have access to the full kind of thing. And it was very much from the victim, what they would want. I wouldn't want to give over all my details again. I just feel like I'm out of control of my own data again. So doing all those kind of things, and it de-risks you as a company. Our CTO's view on hacking, that's our biggest risk. If we get hacked, we're done. That is the bomb, because everything that we do is built on trust and keeping good control of their data and privacy. And his kind of attitude to that is you will always be hacked. That's kind of the mentality that you have to have. And how can you de-risk yourself as much as possible? So we don't keep anything that we don't need to. We don't keep any images. We turn it into its data and then kind of use that as a digital fingerprint. So then we're not keeping any of that either. So it's good for the people that you're working with. It's respectful to them, but it's also good governance for you as a company as well.
Thank you, Laura. We're coming up to the end of our time here. So I just want to take a moment to share with you information on our upcoming sessions before I ask the very last question for our panelists today. So we have, I host a Design for Women workshop in which I share key insights from all of the research I've done with several gender practitioners around the world. I host it from time to time, and we have a couple of dates coming up in November. So in case that's interesting for anyone, take a look at the link. And then we have also another conversation just like this one coming up on designing for women in crisis. And we'll have two incredible practitioners sharing their insights and work. And that is on November 22nd. And I've also shared the RSVP link for that in the chat. So we have 5 minutes remaining. And for the last question to wrap up, I just want to ask all three of you, if there's one thing you'd like for our listeners to walk away with today, what would that be?
I think not just for teenage girls, but for women, to think that you have a right to public space and to look at the way that public space is designed. And this applies to online as well. Assume you have a right to it and then ask how it is failing with you rather than assume it's not for you.
And in a very similar vein, I would say that recognize the harms that exist, but don't let that be the way you interact with the online world. Because, you know, we have every right to be happy online, watch silly videos on TikTok, you know, create businesses, fall in love, everything. So don't let the harm be the way we build a future that we deserve and have a right to.
I'm going to end on the same note because, yeah, if you don't have that mentality, the people that are doing this are what they want. So that's exactly what they wanted. So take up, yeah, I completely agree. Take up that space. And yeah.
Thank you all so much. So walking away with taking up as much space as we can and asking to make that space work for us. Thank you for the inspiration. Thank you so much to Susanna and Hera and Laura for being here and for sharing this space with us and for sharing your insights with us. And thank you so much for the work that you do. You're an inspiration in all of the things that you're doing. Thank you also to all of our listeners who were here today and for all the incredible questions that came through from you all. And I will see you at a future conversation. Thank you all for being here and have a lovely day. Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. It was so wonderful. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and now you all know each other. So keep the relationship going. And I'm sure there will be lots of crossing paths.
Yeah, it was really good to meet you both here, and Laura, and do stay in touch. It will be, you know, there's so many crossovers in terms of what we're doing, and it's just great to find out about it.
Yeah, and Laura, let's meet up because I'm in London like every week.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool. That's great. Awesome. Nice to meet you. Thank you for the invite, Mansi, as well. And yeah, no, Susan, I really liked your point at the very beginning of this talk about kind of made me think about making how girls aren't in, and it really shows that kind of, sorry, I don't know how to verbalize, but there's kind of latent kind of things that we're being told and like taking up space. And that was kind of a story I was going to share, but I realized we're out of time. But when I was younger and like kind of less confident, that was one of the things I used to do as I would go into restaurants and I was trying to build up my confidence. And I noticed I would always take up the smallest table, like in a corner. And I'd feel terrible about taking up a big space, but then I challenged myself to do that. And men have no issue with it. It's so funny. It's just the way that we've been brought up and conditioned. But yeah.
No, it's really interesting because we see the beginnings of it in school playgrounds where boys are encouraged to take up the entire playground playing football, and girls are basically said, "Oh, well, you get space around the edges."
Yeah, the monkey
but
bars.
there are some really good organisations doing work on that in schools as well, which is great. But you know, it comes in from the very, you know, absolutely from the very start. There's also a fantastic paper called either Throw Like a Girl or Throwing Like a Girl. And it's 20 or 30 years old, but it's about exactly how girls are taught to do that instead of that, and how that, but you know, and it's running for that and talking about feminism in general, not just about the physiology of sport. It's such a great thing.
Yeah, it's could talk about this forever, but
yes, so we better go and do something. Better go and change the world. Smash the patriarchy.
Nice to meet you both, Mansi. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Bye.
Bye.